Okay, well, welcome everyone. My name is Elizabeth Drembus, and I am the genealogist for the William and Mary Bray School Lab. In service to the Bray School Lab's mission to uncovering, documenting, preserving, and disseminating the history and legacies of the Williamsburg Bray School, we host a monthly series on Zoom in order to share recent genealogical findings, engage the descendant community in this work in order to broaden our understanding of the legacies, and enlist the help of historians and genealogists, as well as the general public, in furthering the conversations and the research surrounding the Williamsburg Bray School. The title of the monthly series is Bray School Stories, and this evening's focus is Finding Isaac B. So first, some housekeeping items. Once again, we are recording this session. It will be available later on our YouTube channel. To find it, simply Google Bray School Lab YouTube. If you prefer not to be recorded, please feel free to access this later from our YouTube channel. The monthly sessions are designed to spark conversation. I will share a slide and some information, and then we'll pause to take questions and invite you to share your thoughts and your comments. And questions can be raised in the chat and or raised just verbally after each slide. And a feature that we started at our November session is I will share a link to a Google Drive document that has a list of the documents that I'm going to be referencing throughout the session. This way you can either pull them up as you wish or refer back to them later on. And I'm happy to answer questions and hear comments about the documents as well. Let me go ahead and share that link, and then we can get started. There we go. Okay. So that link should allow you to access the documents that we're going to be referencing this evening. So without further ado, let me go ahead and get started. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. Terrific. Let's see. It will let me do this. There we go. Okay. So welcome everyone. We're going to talk about finding Isaac B., one of the scholars at the Williamsburg Bray School. What we start with is where we always start with, is the attendance list. The attendance list of 1765 is where we see Isaac's name appear. And he is described as Mr. Blair's Isaac. And we don't know from this list his age in particular. Only one of the three attendance lists actually lists the ages of the students. But from Robert Carter Nicholas's letter, he says that he's gauging the ages of the children to be between 4 and 10 years old, which gives us an approximate year of birth between 1755 and 1761. Now, a couple of things to keep in mind. Robert Carter Nicholas is the trustee here in Williamsburg at the time of the Bray School operation between 1760 and 1774. And he is writing and reporting back to the Bray associates who are in London. So that's the correspondence. That's where we're finding a lot of the information about the school itself and about the attendance lists. And this is actually a transcription of the correspondence. And the William and Mary students who are part of the William and Mary Bray School Lab are working on transcriptions. And so you can go to the William and Mary Bray School Lab website, and you can go to our research portal, and you can access the correspondence that our students have been transcribing from the original handwritten documents. But back to Isaac. So this is what we know. Isaac came out of Mr. Blair's household, along with several other students also that year. And that year in 1765, the teacher, Ann Wager, had a total of 34 students in the classroom that year. Anyone have any questions at this point about the attendance lists or how we know about the students that attended?
Elizabeth, there's a question in the chat.
Okay.
Can you clarify the the Mr. Blair identity?
We can. So we know from other records in Colonial Williamsburg that Mr. Blair is John Blair. He's the president of the William and Mary Board of Visitors at that time.
So it's not John Blair Jr.
No,
Okay, so it's probably the father then.
right.
Awesome, thank you.
Sure. Any other questions before we move on? This is great. No? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and on to the next slide. So at this point, we have the attendance list, and then we have this advertisement that's placed 9 years later in the Virginia Gazette out of Mecklenburg County. And what we find is Isaac B. is self-emancipating from a Lewis Burwell. And we know that this is the same Isaac because it lists the fact that he had been enslaved in President Blair's household. The other thing we notice is there's a description of his age. Isaac is listed as between 18 and 19 years old. And he also, Lewis Burwell mentions that Isaac believes he has a right to his freedom because his father was a free man. And the other thing to note is that Lewis Burwell notes that Isaac B. can read. And we know that that was one of the things one of the points in the Williamsburg Bray School and wager was to teach the children to read. And so it's a clear indication that if Isaac had already learned how to read, or at least that reading skill was being enforced at the Williamsburg Bray School, and he continued being able to read. So this is what we start with. We start with Isaac having attended in 1765, and we know that he self-emancipated in 1774. Now I'm coming in, I started here in the lab back in March, but a lot of research was done on Isaac B. prior to my arrival. And so I am actually grateful to the work of Dr. Antonio Bly and Julie Richter for really for researching Isaac and leaving kind of a breadcrumb trail from which to get started. And I'm about ready to go to the next slide unless anyone has any other comments or questions about things that you're noticing in this ad, things that kind of stand out to you, or things you might have questions about.
Elizabeth, I would just want to note the date of this runaway ad. It's September 1774. This is a month after the Bray School has closed, a month after Anne Wager's death in August. I think there's something symbolic here on some level that the school has closed, but the impact of the school continues, and we see a very emboldened Isaac B. self-emancipating.
Absolutely. And the fact that the ad was published in September, but Lewis Burwell notes that Isaac had actually left 2 months prior to that. So when the school actually was still operating, and it looks as though Lewis Burwell noted that Isaac was probably gone back to Williamsburg at this point. So.
Elizabeth, I have a comment.
Sure.
On the Zoom tonight is a young woman named Vicki McGill. She can tell you her connection to the Blairs, not to this one, but to the son.
Okay.
And Vicki, if you don't mind introducing yourself.
Good evening. My name is Vicki McGill. Nicole Brown actually knows me. I've been around the Lemon Project for a little while. I actually have a couple of ancestors, Benjamin White and Benjamin White Jr. And Benjamin White Jr. was enslaved by John Blair Jr. So
Okay.
that's why I asked about which Blair is this.
Right.
So,
Right. Thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for contributing that. That's fantastic. That's what these sessions are all about, is to just sharing that information and also sharing those connections. So thank you so much.
thank you. And thank you, Jeanette, for pushing me off mute.
Excellent. I'm going to go ahead on to the next slide. So as we mentioned, there was research done by Antonio Bly and by Julie Richter. Also Paul Heinig in his free website on Free African Americans of Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware lists free people also carrying the B surname in other Virginia counties, in particular Northumberland County. And I haven't been able to match or find familial connections, but that's always sticking in the back of my mind as to whether we might be able to link them or not. And there is a bit of a discussion on who Isaac's parents are. What we know is that his father was a free man. Most likely he was a free Black man. And the theory right now, and the working assumption, is that his father was a man by the name of John Inscoe B. His mother, however, remains a little bit of a mystery. There was some thought that perhaps she was a white indentured woman. Having a mixed race child based on the laws at the time would have meant that she would have had to have Isaac in indentured servitude up until the age of 31. We don't really see that coming out. Isaac is always listed as a slave, as a slave man, and even past the age of 31, he continues to be enslaved. So maybe more likely that his mother is an enslaved woman. At this point, we're just not really sure. I post this picture of Henning statutes because the law is very clear about people, their status in colonial era. And so if we can determine, if we ever are able to determine Isaac's mother's status, we may know a little bit more about how the law was and how he was a part of where the law was affecting his status. So the research is ongoing on Isaac's parentage. So, but I wanted to just make sure that we mention that. I haven't been able to really find anything conclusive. And really for us in the lab, what we're trying to find are the descendants of the children that attended the Williamsburg Bray School. And so we kind of look forward. We're going to go Isaac and then look for his, for any siblings or children. And so that's where the research is really, the focus is. So any questions, any comments with regard to this slide? All right, I'm going to go forward and show kind of where the research then went from there. So with any African-American research, particularly when you're looking at the colonial era, especially if you're looking at enslaved African-Americans, we're going to also have to research the white family. And so how do we know that Lewis Burwell how do we know that he came by Isaac in his household? Well, so we know that John Blair was the original enslaver. So it's important to understand John Blair's family makeup. What we're able to find in his will is that he had a daughter named Christian. And in his will, he names her as Christian Burwell, which means we know that she then is married. If dad is listing her with her married name in his will, she was a married woman at that point. But who did she marry? That became clear when, with a birth register from the Bruton Parish baptism records, where we see Lewis Burwell was born, the son of Armistead Burwell and Christian, his wife. And Lewis was born in 1745. So what we're able to then determine is that Lewis Burwell is John Blair's grandson, and that is most likely then how Isaac wound up in his plantation named Stoneland in Mecklenburg County, which is about 2.5 hours driving from Williamsburg. And So that's how we can determine that we've got the same Isaac B. that would have been enslaved in President Blair's household, attended the Bray School, and then now was enslaved at Stoneland Plantation in Mecklenburg. So that was kind of a lot, but it's important to also know that, you know, we can corroborate what we're seeing in the records. Does anyone have any questions regarding the will, why we use wills, the records that are available and where they're available? No? All right, we will go ahead and move on then. So what we're able to determine is that in 1774, Isaac B. was captured, because we do see Isaac in the Burwell family household enslaved in the 1782 personal property tax list. The Virginia tax list, and it dawned on me, or I've discovered recently that I have been saying in workshops and in presentations that the Virginia tax records are just one of my go-to sources, particularly for 1783, 84, and 86, because those are the years when tax list takers were naming the enslaved members of the household, not only the person who was being taxed, but also the names of the slaves. But what I found with Mecklenburg County is the tax list takers there name them as early as 1782, and they continue to 1812, which is a gold mine of information to have that many years of that many names being repeated and being present in the records. So I really recommend using the tax records, because we use those particularly in between the years when we don't, between census records. Now, in Virginia, in 1790, census is not existent anymore for Virginia. And in 1800, I think we only have 2 counties that survive. So these tax records become even more invaluable for tracing and tracking family members, and also names of enslaved people in those households. So that was kind of a lot of information. Anybody comments or questions here? Okay. Well, so Isaac continues being in the Burwell family. And by 1784, it appears as though Isaac is now having a family, because we see a John B. listed in the tax record. And the comma in between John and B kind of caught me up short. Was this 2 different people, or was this one person? And later tax records indicate that John B is actually one person, and it's clearly, there's no comma in between, it's clearly one person. And the fact that that B name, that B surname is following him in the records is just remarkable, I think. And so again, this is still Louis Burwell's Mecklenburg County 1784 tax list, where we're able to see Isaac and then what looks like his son, John B. We don't really have any indication of who John's mother is. We don't have them in the tax record. It does not appear that the families are grouped together. And so right now, John's mother is still a little bit of a mystery to us. So, any questions before we move on?
I have a question.
Sure.
I'm looking. Sorry, I think I just muted myself again.
Yeah.
Sorry. I apologize, everybody. Under the line where it says John B, it says Christian. Do we have any understanding of who that may be?
It would be another enslaved person in his household.
So it just happens to have the same name as the mom.
As Lewis's mom. Yep.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Thank
Yeah. Good catch. Yeah. Yeah. All right, I'm gonna go, and honestly, if you see the Spotswood name up there in the 3rd line, Spotswood is a similar name to Louis Burwell's brother, Spotswood Burwell. or Burrell. It's also the maiden name of Lewis's first wife, Anne Spotswood. So we do start to see some of, some naming patterns for sure. And the idea that Isaac would have named his son John kind of gives credence that perhaps to Isaac's father being named John, John Inscoby. So we do see a repetition of names. Yeah. All right, I'm going to go on to the next slide. So that's 1784. And I need to kind of do a shout out to my colleague, Tanya Meredith, who found this record when she was reading through Life by the Roaring Roanoke. We were looking for something else, and she came across this and shared this with me, that there was an indication, there's a write-up in 1785 of a court case in Mecklenburg County in which Isaac was called as a witness. And this is, it just blew me away that, there's this kind of record for him. Now, the author of Life by the Roaring Roanoke cited some personal papers of a historian in Mecklenburg County, and we're doing our best to try and see if we can get a hold of those papers to see what else might be in there. And so the court case had to do with a possible slave insurrection that was happening. And so Isaac was called as a witness. And I wasn't able, so I went to the court documents just online really quickly on Family Search and was able to pull up what we're looking on the right-hand side is actually the final decree of that court case. And so it does corroborate that there was such a court case, and it does corroborate the what was written in the Life by the Roaring Roanoke of the final decree. But what we'd love to do, what I'd love to do, is to be able to find that court record. And so we're planning a trip back to Mecklenburg County. Tanya and I've already gone once. We're definitely planning to go back again. What I'd love to be able to do is find that court record, because in it, is it possible that what Isaac said would have been recorded, and to have his words be able to be part of the narrative about him, I think would just be phenomenal. So that is, that's the hope, that I don't want to just have a secondary source like the Life by the Roaring Roanoke. Really want to be able to find the court record where we can see what exactly Isaac was saying. And I just think that would be, that would just be great. So any comments, any questions? I see something perhaps in the chat. Is that? I don't know if I can see it.
It was just me saying it's an incredible find. So well done, Tanya and Elizabeth.
Yes, well done, Tanya. So, anybody else, any other questions?
I have another question.
Sure.
What is the year of this quote? And is it after after the ad about him escaping?
So yes, this is in 1785. So 1774 was that first advertisement. And then he was captured and was back in the Burrell household as of 1782. And then in 1784 is when we see him in the tax record again, that time with his son. And then this is 1785.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Sure, sure. And we wanted to make sure, I'm going to go ahead to the next slide. What we wanted to make sure was, is there a possibility that there's another Isaac out there? Because it didn't list his surname in that that reference in that book. And so we will go to the 1785 tax list, and sure enough, there's Isaac, and he is the only Isaac in that household in Mecklenburg County. So we're pretty sure it's him. And but again, I want to see if we can find that original source, that primary document, which would just be, I think, a real coup. What we do see, however, so 1785, Isaac is in the household, but in the 1786 list, Isaac's not mentioned anymore. So that could mean several different possibilities. Burwell had different properties. Perhaps he moved Isaac onto a different property. Perhaps Isaac self-emancipated again. Perhaps Isaac passed away. Perhaps Isaac was sold. And so that was the next thing we had to find was, so we know that in 1786, Isaac's not there in the tax record. He had been pretty consistently in there. Then where was he? So the next record that I'm going to show is really kind of gives a lot of clarification of what happens next to Isaac. And that is a bill of sale from Henrico County. And so this record is written by a man by the name of Richard Littlepage. And in it, he is talking about how he is selling his right to Isaac B. And it appears that Richard Littlepage purchased Isaac B from a man named David Lambert. But not only did Richard Littlepage purchase part of Isaac B, but a man by the name of Samuel McCraw went in together. And so in 1793, and this is in February of 1793, Richard Littlepage is selling his share to Samuel McCraw. So it gives us a sense of what Isaac has now been through since 1785. He obviously was sold to a David Lambert and then sold again to these other two men. The document helps as far as how we're going to trace that we have a date of 5 February 1793. We have the list of enslavers now: David Lambert, Richard Littlepage, Samuel McCraw. We also have locations that are listed in the document. We have Hanover County, we have the city of Richmond, Charles City County is mentioned, as well as Henrico County. So all of those become possible places to look for documentation, to see if we can find out more about any of these men, and see if we can find out more then about Isaac himself. So the other thing to point out is there's a lot of horses also being mentioned in this. In Mecklenburg County at that time, what I've been learning is the precursor to what we think of as Kentucky nowadays. There was horse breeding, horse racing going on. So this was part of this bill of sale, is that you have not only horses being sold, but you also have people being sold. So any questions about this? There's a lot here, and I'm happy to read through some of it if you have questions about certain lines or things that kind of strike you. Yes, Ms. Brown.
Hi. It's not necessarily about this document, but I was curious if on the 1785, 1786 property list, if Isaac's son had been mentioned on either of those.
So we do have a John in one of them, and John, but the B name wasn't recorded. And so that at first it did give me pause that perhaps they had been either sold together or moved to a different piece of property. But as it turns out, we're going to see John B in some later tax records, still at Stoneland Plantation.
Thank you.
Sure. All right, I'm going to go ahead on to the next slide. The next slide, so keep in mind that this bill of sale is dated 5 February 1793. And in March of 1793, Isaac B self-emancipates again. And this time, Richard Littlepage is the one who places the ad in the Virginia Gazette. The quality of the ad is the graphic is not very, very clear. So I've also provided a transcript that can be also seen at the Geography of Slavery website. this is the last record where we see Isaac so far. I'm hoping the research will yield, we'll be able to find some more out about Isaac. But Richard Littlepage is able to describe him quite well, and also his circumstances. Isaac's described between 30 and 40 years of age. We know his height. We know scars on his hands. He also mentions that he can both read and write. And writing is a big question, whether or not the children at the Williamsburg Bray School were taught to write. But we know that by 1793, Isaac was able to write. Richard Littlepage is able to describe Isaac's clothing that he wore. And Isaac took a horse with him. He took a horse and a saddle and a bridle and saddlebags filled with papers and books that were relative to the business of the sheriff. So was this a planned departure, or was it a moment of opportunity for Isaac? And so, did Isaac know that presumably he would know he was going to have been sold to Samuel McCraw? And so where was he headed? We just don't know. Was he headed north, or was he headed back to see his family? What was the pull there? We just don't know. But this is the last record so far that we've been able to uncover that has information on Isaac in it. And I just, it kind of gives me hope that maybe he made it. And, but to be so far away from his family, that also kind of tugs at those heartstrings a little bit as well. So, but I wanted to make sure that you all had this and could see it. Any questions or comments? Because we're going to we're going to move back over to John B in just a second, but this is where we're going to have to say goodbye to Isaac for a little while. So, all right, I'm going to go ahead on to the next slide. So as Ms. Brown mentioned, did we know whether John B was in the property tax records? We do see John B in the 1793 tax list, the same year that Isaac was self-emancipating. And then we also continue to see John B into the records up until 1800. And 1800 is when Louis Burwell passes away. So this is where we're able to see then this next generation. And this is then where our research picks up. And so I'm going to walk you through kind of the records that we use. But before we leave the tax records, any comments, any concerns, any questions, any surprises? I see things in the chat. So, let's see if I can access the question. Considering
the chat, sorry, Elizabeth, is pertaining to the reward amounts from previous slide, $10 for the man and $20 for the horse. So just the disparity there.
Right. No, it's a good call. You're absolutely right. Yeah, what was of more value to Richard Littlepage at that point? Yeah. Let's see. Oops, hold on. Okay. I have lost my bar oh, there it is. Okay, good. All right. Any other comments? Any questions? All right. So now to track John. And the way we do that is when Louis Burwell died, his estate had to be inventoried. And basically that means they are making a record of every book, every plate, every quilt, every cow, every bushel of wheat, as well as the list of the enslaved people at the plantation. And he had several different properties. And so we were able to find an entry for a John B in parentheses on the old field. And so people are still putting that surname, associated with him. And what was also important to look at is to see what else we have going on here and how many other Johns are there. And so before we could go too much further, we needed to just make sure that we were reading the entire list of all the enslaved people on Burrell's property. So we see a John who is named as the grandchild of Nanny. And we also see a John who's listed with what looks like a family grouping of Emmanuel, Patience, Little Charles, and John. And the important thing here is, while we are pretty sure we know John B is the son of Isaac B, when we go to see where John B's next step is, these are descriptors that we have John with an Emmanuel and Patience, that we have John with a grandmother. And so will that help us be able to distinguish which John went with which Burrell heir? So these are images from the inventory of Louis Burrell's property in Mecklenburg County as well as Franklin County. And any questions before we move on from there? Yes, Ms. Brown.
How far are Mecklenburg and Franklin from each other?
That is a really good question. I don't know the answer right offhand, but I can Google it real fast.
That's okay. I can do that. Sorry,
Okay.
I had a thought that maybe if they were close by, would there be crossover if these people might have some type of relation to each other? But I'll find that out.
Okay, that's a good question. Thank you. That's really good. Yeah, I'm going to write that down. And Johns related to each other. Okay, great. Thank you. That's a really good suggestion.
So Elizabeth, a couple things in the chat.
Mhm.
Nicole has noted that the distance between the two places is approximately 90 miles.
Okay.
And then there is a question from Jessica Ramey. Is there any chance those are additional Johns? And if Jessica, if you want to clarify, please jump in.
Sure. I was just wondering if they were not necessarily additional John B's, but is it possible that they are other Johns that were, a part of this household at that time? Or can you be fairly certain that they are connected to John B?
I'm not sure at all that they're connected to John B. But what I needed to make sure was that we were aware of when when the enslaved property or the enslaved people were distributed amongst the heirs, that we had accounted for every possible John, because what we're finding in the records is after this inventory, the B is dropped. So then we needed to make sure, how do we know what John we're talking about if we don't have that surname to kind of associate with him? Does that make sense?
It absolutely does. Thank you so much.
Sure, sure. Okay, I'm going to go ahead on to the next screen. If I can get this toolbar off. There we go. Okay, so the next step was to figure out who all the heirs would have been that would have been entitled to any of Louis Burrell's property. So the important thing to learn is that Louis Burrell was married twice and had 11 children who made it to adulthood with his first wife and 4 children who made it to adulthood with his second wife. Now, fortunately, somebody was brilliant when they made his tombstone, because on his tombstone is listed the date of his marriage to his first wife, all of their children, and who they married, the death of his first wife, the marriage to his second wife, all of their children, and who they married. So that at least gave me all the players that we were dealing with. And because you were dealing with children of the first wife and children of the second wife, the Burrell family is quite litigious, which is great if you're a genealogist, because the more records there are available, the more opportunity you have to figure out, what happens next. And it's not that everybody is just following dad's will and everything's been taken care of and it's outside of the courts. This way, it was absolutely in the courts because the chancery records for the Burrell family are incredible. And the chancery records are all mostly digitized and available online at the Library of Virginia. And I totally recommend them. If you haven't started using chancery records yet with your genealogical research, they are a gold mine of information. So this is where we went to find what happened to John. And so in the Chancery Court records in 1804, we do see 3 different Johns. We see one John who was valued at 45 pounds, one John valued at 35 pounds, and then John with a Patience, so Patience and son John, valued at 110. And this is why it was important to make sure that we were trying to distinguish the different Johns from the inventory so that we would have some basis for figuring out who was going where. So these are the way the enslaved names were listed in the Chancery Court record. It was very much a grouping of who was going to be going with which Burrell heir. And so my job was then to figure out and determine where our John B was and where he was going to be headed next. So this is an image from the Chancery Court records, the same record in 1804. That record is about 33 pages long because there's also not only are the enslaved people mentioned and where they're going to be, who they're going to be allotted to, but then there's also land that was under consideration. And the Burrell children from the first wife were very concerned that they got the amount of land that they felt they were entitled and not so much for the younger half siblings. So in this list, we see circled in red, there is a John that was valued at that 35-pound mark, went to A. Boyd. And A. Boyd is Alexander Boyd, who married Louis Burrell's daughter, Matilda Burrell. And so that's one possibility. Jonathan Burrell in the second column was allotted Patience and John. And so that, at least we know now where 2 of the Johns were going to. I'm inclined to think that the John that went to Alexander Boyd is John B, but we still need to make sure that we're doing our due diligence and finding out where that 3rd John was. So this other page shows that there were slaves allotted to the widow Burrell. And what is important to know is that Elizabeth Burrell, when she married Louis, her maiden name was Harrison. She came from the Benjamin Harrison family, and she brought with her enslaved people to that marriage. And so those people would have still been considered part of her Harrison family inheritance. And so any enslaved people that she was going to be receiving as her widow's dower would be separate from that grouping. And so that was made very clear in the Chancery records. And what we see is very clearly written out into the record that there is a group of enslaved people, including a man named John, which came by her, which means those were brought into the marriage from the Harrisons. And that meant that the other Burrell children from the first marriage would not have been entitled to this group. And so then there was another list of enslaved people that were going to be allotted to Mrs. Burrell. So if this John is part of the group that came with her in 1789, when she married Louis Burrell, this is not John B. So I believe we can eliminate this John. And so we just stick with the 2 Johns that went to either Alexander Boyd or Jonathan Burrell. Does that make sense? It was kind of a lot, but does that make sense? And does anybody have any questions? or does anybody see any flaws in my reasoning? Because I'm happy to also entertain that I'm completely on the wrong track. And so I really need to rethink something if somebody sees something different. I can see something in the chat. If John be his patient son, can he be, if John is patient son, yes, he could be. I will say that when he was listed in the inventory, there was a man named Emmanuel listed prior to that. Emmanuel, Patience, Little Charles, and John. So could Emmanuel be that John's father, or could that Emmanuel be Patience's spouse because Isaac is no longer at the plantation? And would Emmanuel be John B's stepfather? So it is a good question. It's something I definitely don't want to, I don't want to not consider looking at both the Jonathan Burrell line as well as the Alexander Boyd line in an effort to determine John B. The other thing to also think about is when in the inventory, John is listed, he's listed separate from that John B that was clearly stated on the other part of the inventory with the initial B. Also from the tax records, we also get a sense of how old John B is. By 1793, I think, or at least by 1800, he was above the age of 16. And so would a 16-year-old still be listed with a family grouping on the plantation, or would he have been considered of age? So those are all the questions that I kind of ask about that. Yeah. And that absolutely, if Patience has a new husband, could that explain the name B being left off? Absolutely. Absolutely. And then would he have been counted twice in the inventory? John B with the B in parentheses on one part of the inventory, and then John with the family grouping. Would he have been counted twice? Not normally you're going to count twice because they're going to want to keep, they have to, in the estate account, they're going to have to report that to the court. So I would think that the John B that has the initials on the one page of the inventory is very much a separate person from the John who's listed with Emmanuel and Patience and Charles in the inventory. Yeah. All right. So let's see. All right. So that's kind of where the research has kind of taken us at this point. So these are the questions that I'm left with, but I'm curious to hear your questions of besides the ones that have been raised in the chat, which were brilliant. Thank you. We definitely want to continue the search for Isaac B in records of Richard Littlepage and Samuel McCraw. And definitely start to tease out following the next Burrell line, searching for John B, either in the Boyd family, the Jonathan Burrell family, and really looking at those two lines. But are there questions that you all have?
Hi, Elizabeth.
Hi.
Thank you again for this presentation. You know, I've been, looking into Isaac for quite some time, and now it seems, and I'm finding there's an Isaac B in Richmond that's listed later, like in 1870 census, and there are ties to Goochland, and I've always wondered if there was a tie. Is this a totally different Isaac? Is this tied to the Isaac that we're searching for? But he appears quite prominently in Richmond, and then of course I found those ties to Goochland, and there are several B's, that B surname that's in Richmond, as we move into the latter part of the 19th century. So just curious if there are any ties there.
Yeah, that'd be, I mean, it wouldn't be out of the realm of possibilities for sure that, we are starting to see a naming pattern within the enslaved family lines where that name would be honored throughout that family. And so could the Isaac who's showing up in 1870s be a grandson or another son? I don't think it's going to be our Isaac, the Bray School scholar
Yeah.
Isaac, having been born in the 1750s, but it's absolutely a possibility. There's also, Heinig has a lot of B family members in Northumberland County, and I haven't been able to quite make the connection yet to
Yeah, I was,
Isaac. Do you have that?
no, I was thinking in terms of, I mean, my question was, I mean, did he have another family? I mean, was there other children? I mean, because he's relatively a pretty young man, even when he's being sold twice. I mean, he's in his
Okay.
probably 40s at that time, 30s. Um, so that raised my question, just to see that name, or could there be some ties to his father's enslaver, who, from what I understand, his name was Isaac B.
Isaac B's father?
John B. The Isaac B. of the Bray Schools. His
Mhm,
father, John B.
mhm.
Not his father, but I guess the man who he's named after. He has some connection to, based on David Manker's
Right.
research.
And I
Um,
think just to include some stuff that Dr. Johnson and I have been talking about, and you and I too, Elizabeth, I really do think what Dr. Johnson is saying is correct. And we really need to look at Obadiah Smith that we've already talked about, who did have homes and plantations in Goochland, and then owned Sherwood Forest before the Tylers took over, which is the Brown family, which is, I mean, could have something to do with this too. I think that Obadiah Smith definitely needs some extra looking at.
Okay. Okay, good. Yep, I'm noting that down. Look at him. Yeah, if Isaac, if Isaac made it to, be free and after 1793, and then was able to establish himself and have have a new family, absolutely. I think that absolutely it's possible. I would think so. Yeah. All right, so Obadiah Smith, Goochland County. We'll zero in on him. Thank you.
just my 2 cents.
I love it. I love it. Thanks. So I do want to be mindful of the time, and I also want to make sure that I bring up to your attention an event that's happening here. First, I do want to say thank you to everyone who joined us this evening. We're excited to have you be a part of this journey with us. We will be back with a new session and a new scholar focus on Monday, February 26th at 6 o'clock. And since you registered for this evening session, we will send out a link for our February session. And if you are in the area, in the Williamsburg area, on Saturday, February 17th, I invite you to join us at the Williamsburg Bray School community event. It's a descendant community event. And Maureen, do you have the link to share in the chat with folks for the registration?
I will have to grab it. Let me also just expand on this just a little bit to give people some understanding of the event.
Oh,
It
okay.
is an event, is a community event. Descendant community members are encouraged to attend. It is a broader community event in terms of you don't have to be a descendant community member if you're interested. If you support descendant community members, so we're looking at community more broadly, but it will be an opportunity for community members to hear from both the W&M Bray School Lab and, of course, the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation with the different divisions within each about the progress of the research findings, really an opportunity to ask questions, and we're very much interested in moving forward. We are in 2024, the year of the Bray School, looking forward to a fall completion of the building and opening. But there's a lot of work to be done, so we're looking for feedback and for input in terms of interpretation, expectations, um, what people want and need. Um, to experience, to understand as we look at fall 2024 and move forward. There'll be a lot of things happening beyond the fall, beyond 2024, but this is an opportunity for some real engagement about how we're going to go about this and be successful um, institutionally, but very much at a community level. What does success look like when we look at collaboration? So this is under the Bray School Initiative, Colonial Williamsburg um, Foundation, and William Mary Bray School Lab partnership.
Terrific. Thank you. And thank you. It looks like Nicole found the link and shared that. Thank you so much. So people can register for that. It is going to be from 11 to 2 on that day, and refreshments will be served. So food and refreshments will be available as well. So,
Right. We are asking people if they would. It would be a great help if you would register, just a simple registration, and that will also allow us to capture any information around dietary restrictions and food allergies.
exactly. So. And then as we would certainly want you to stay in touch with us, even if you're not in the Williamsburg area. For the latest news and happenings from the William and Mary Bray School Lab, you can visit our website and follow us on social media. As we are affectionately calling 2024 the year of the Bray School. As Maureen just mentioned, the restored Williamsburg Bray School building will open in the fall in Colonial Williamsburg. The research is certainly going to continue beyond 2024 as we work toward discovering descendants of all the children who attended the Williamsburg Bray School. So I want to thank you all again for joining the conversation this evening. But if there are any, I'm happy to take some more questions if we have a little bit of time, if people want to linger just a little bit longer. I see something in the chat. Is the event come and go, or is it the entire time? Maureen and Nicole, the question is about the community event.
Yeah. Well, it is designed for ideally for people who can spend the entirety. We know that people are busy. The first portion of the program will be information sharing. We will have lunch and opportunity for individuals to talk among themselves, but also to look at the materials that we'll bring there. And then the final portion of the program will really be listening to community members, hearing perspectives, suggestions, and kind of how do we move forward to get to fall 2024 and beyond.